So good afternoon, everybody, to the Ferguson-Florissant School District and our entire family. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm really excited about the work we're launching today with Achievement Network, or ANet. And I'm so excited to be with you, even though it's virtual, as we kick off this year that holds, I believe, a lot of promise and hope that will change the trajectory of our district, our community, and our students' lives. So please listen carefully, because this is some very important work we're about to undertake. ANet is a nationally recognized nonprofit founded by educators for educators. And if you're like me, who started as a bus driver and was a teacher and so on, you're all educators. Our hope is that our partnership with ANet will help shift the culture of our district so that Ferguson-Florissant is known for equity, social justice, liberation, and high quality education for all students. As you go through this afternoon, you're going to be asked to consider your why. Why do you get up every day and do this work? Why do you put in the long hours and the late nights? Why do you, in a very short period of time, revolutionize the way you teach and students learn? For me, my why is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And a big part of that happiness comes from building hope for others. I know that these last several months have been quite stressful for all of us. I know there are times when we all are short with one another, when we speak or we sound unkind. When you hear that creeping in, I'd encourage you to remember your why. Breathe, collect yourself, and get back to doing the great work you're doing for our students. That gives meaning to the work. Since the merger of our district in the 1970s, FergFlor has grappled with providing equitable and inclusive, high quality education for all students. Over the last few years, FergFlor leaders have participated in training on equity, social justice, anti-bias, and anti-racism. In April of 2018, the board adopted an equity resolution, and an equity committee was formed to implement the principles of that resolution. Over a period of 3 years, district leaders also participated in the Public Education Leadership Project at Harvard. Through that work, we identified a problem of practice and realized that overall, the relationships between our teachers and our students needed to be strengthened if our students were to thrive. Let me say this clearly. We have a problem, and it lies in our relationships.
People are having a lot of work done.
And many times those problems come from what we perceive to be our differences, which at times starts with our race, the color of your skin. My hope is that the work we're beginning today will strengthen our relationships across the district and make our work more enjoyable, and more importantly, make our students more successful. In the days following the death of George Floyd, our district took a stand. We took to the streets to demonstrate to our community that the lives of our students matter, that the lives of our Black students matter. Our teachers are over 70% white, and over 90% of our students are either Black or students of color. So yes, Black lives matter. The lives of our students matter. Our very reason for existing as a school system matters. Race matters and affects our interactions and our teaching and learning every day. We can't afford to turn a colorblind eye to race, regardless of how you feel about the Black Lives Matter movement or the organization. If you're here in Ferg Floor, you have to acknowledge that the Black lives of our students and colleagues matter, or we will continue to flounder like a ship stuck in shallow water, battered by the waves, unable to sail as it was intended. In the time that I've been in this district, I've heard from community members in their 60s who were part of the first class to be bused from Kinloch to McClure North. One woman said to me, "I've never felt welcomed, not by the students or the teachers." She's in her 60s and still walking through with those wounds from the early 70s. And it sounds like they're as raw as they were back then. It's been almost 50 years and her scars still remain. Those scars, they don't just scar the victim, they scar the families. We have families in our district, and some of you in this session know personally what I'm about to say. Those scars pass down from generation to generation. We have students walking around hurting. They don't even know why, but it goes back to when their parents and grandparents were not included. They didn't feel welcome. And that's before most of us was even around. But we can do something about it. For 6 years, our community has been the emblem of the battle against racism and served as the tipping point to demand change to systems rooted in 4 centuries of racism in this country. Emblazoned on the streets from the East Coast to the West Coast are the words, "Black Lives Matter." That movement, with its roots in Ferguson, proclaims the central truth that has eluded a nation built on the backs of men and women whose lives, dignity, and very being were stolen. The racist wounds of this community reach way back and run deep. The wounds were first inflicted before any of us who are leading now was even alive. While that history may not be our fault, it is our duty to expose and dismantle systemic racism and bring equity and opportunity so our students, our families, and our community can thrive. I came to Ferg Floor after watching the protests in the community following Michael Brown's death. As a Black man growing up in the South, I know the effects of systemic racism and the lifelong harm that results from it. I want better for my Black son, for our Black students, and for all of our students. We all, regardless of your race, have been harmed by racism. And we all must stand against racism and injustice. As Dr. King once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Many of you have heard the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. It seems to be human nature to paint groups of people with a single brushstroke. Have you noticed there always seems to be an us and a them? We do that for a variety of reasons, but most often that single story is tied to race. You may be Black, you may be white, and while pieces of your stories may be similar, the truth is that each of our stories is unique. I know what it is to grow up in poverty like many of our students. You may have lived in poverty too, regardless of your race. And while we may have that in common, your story is yours and my story is mine. My lived experiences are unique. I know my experience. I know Joe Davis' experience. I am an expert on Joe Davis, but I can't speak for the experiences of all Black men. If we are to understand, teach, support, and care for others, we must understand ourselves too. We need to do some individual identity work. We need to take a look in the mirror and see who we are. Ask yourself, who am I? What's made me this way? What do I see differently from others because of my race, my gender identity, my experiences? How does all of that affect the way I approach my work, other people, our students, and especially people who don't look like me? Our Board of Education in April of 2018 adopted an equity resolution and has had a first reading of an equity lens tool to use as a guiding lens in all aspects of our district decision-making in order to move our district forward. The board has adopted a new acronym, Equity, E-Q-U-I-T-Y, for Strategic Plan 3.0, and is in the early stages of setting our new goals. You'll have opportunities to have a voice in this strategic planning process, and we'll be sure to share those with you. If we are serious about equity, we are all going to have to work together to achieve these goals. Right now, our country is so divided. If we are to overcome centuries of systems of oppression that have harmed all of us, and yes, even our white colleagues and students have been harmed by oppression, racism, and inequity. If we are to overcome inequity, we must all work together for change. We are in a time where it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. We must take a stand in word and action. In the end, King said, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. I challenge you, do not be silent. If you are comfortable with Dr. King's quotes, but bristle at the words of contemporary civil rights leaders, I'd like to encourage you to ask yourself why. What have we learned collectively and as individuals since he was killed for standing up and speaking out? This is not just a message for our Black colleagues and friends. Power does not cede power. We must all work together for there to be change. We need our white brothers and white sisters. We need our white allies to listen and join us. But even more, we need our white co-conspirators to join for the sake of our students and to use your privilege to demand change. We've made significant strides over these last several years and increased opportunities for our students academically. We're providing more supports for our students' social and emotional development and creating opportunities for post-secondary education and beyond. We've increased the numbers of AP courses we offer, and we've added international baccalaureate. We've expanded middle and high school opportunities with STEAM. And we've opened our Innovation High School at Cool Valley based on the big picture learning model so that our students can learn through their interests, learning through internships, and learning through innovation. We've begun building a pipeline for our students to have good paying jobs and skilled trades with employers like Boeing. We're graduating more students, and we're strengthening our students' opportunities for success in college after graduation. But we still have far to go. Dismantling centuries-old systems is not easy, and the lives of our students are literally at stake. We shifted our student code of conduct, our discipline code, to a student expectation code a few years ago. We've begun working to make it more restorative. If you've watched our board meetings over the summer, you know that the board has charged us with overhauling our student expectation code to fully realize a restorative approach tied to our CI3T models of support. During the 2020-21 school year, we will continue our efforts to strengthen relationships between the adults in our district and our students. If real systemic change is going to occur, we cannot have just individuals or even groups of us embracing this work. It's going to take all of us. This can't be so and so's cause. It has to be your cause. If you work with students in this district, whether you drive a bus, whether you cook those delicious meals, whether you teach math or science or English or special education, or whether you lead in schools, we need you. Our students need you. You matter. It's going to take every one of us. If equity isn't your thing, then ask yourself why. What's going to move your needle so that you will embrace this work? I appreciate all of you for being here today. And this is a district effort to begin transforming the ways in which we educate our children in Ferguson Florissant. At this time, I'd like to introduce Tamoya Rose Watson.
No, everybody in the district.
Tamoya Rose Watson began working
listening to the superintendent
at the Achievement Network as the Director of School Support, partnering with school leaders and standards aligned instruction. She has since worked across the organization to support coaching development, manage district partnerships, and designed a framework to support an anti-racist approach towards educational equity. Tamoya now leads the ANet work long-term anti-racism strategy through the Change team and the anti-racist and culture team. She's excited to be leading a district-wide partnership with Ferguson Florissant around anti-racist development towards institutional equity. Currently, she is supporting anti-racist work to improve the learning outcomes, sense of belonging, and engagement of all students, but especially the most marginalized students. She has a master's degree in teaching English as a second language from Fordham University and postgraduate work in liberation theology, and lives with her husband and 4 children on a farm in Georgia. I'd like to welcome my sister, Ms. Tamoya Rose Watson.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Thank you, everyone. Our team will be sharing stories about our journeys, and they are personal, so please be aware of your feelings and take care of yourself during this time together. So let me tell you about my joy. I've always been working with the most marginalized of society, and that started in the Ukraine in an orphanage. Our central theme was that in you, the fatherless find compassion. And I really internalized compassion. In me, children should find compassion. And that led me to look for where in this country I might work to bring compassion to students. I landed in Newark, New Jersey, in a predominantly African-American population in the inner city. I worked for a school that was on a journey to becoming an anti-racist organization. And for us, that meant that we were learning to expand our perspective on race and power and apply that learning to our practice. And for me, that was the application of compassion for my students. I wanted a better curriculum for my classroom. And through research, learned about math in Singapore and brought that perspective to improve our conceptual thinking around math for both my students and parents. For history, I learned that our African-American textbooks began the history of African Americans with slavery. I went on a journey of searching for a curriculum where African American history began in Africa with kings and queens. Throughout time, I developed an understanding that the challenges that my students experience in life were partly due to a flawed system, but I needed to learn more. So I left the classroom, enrolled in seminary, where I studied liberation theology in a program that focused on the civil rights movements. I was able to experience a traveling program called Sankofa, named for a mystical bird, which means looking back in order to move forward. In that program, we traveled throughout the southern states, meeting civil rights workers from different perspectives and fields, doctors and lawyers, community members, and the like, learning about their work and understanding the complex systems and institutional racism and how those systems lead to oppression. I used the knowledge to build my compassion for students, and that took me back overseas, back to my own birthplace, Jamaica, where I worked with orphans. It's with those experiences that I returned back to the classroom in Newark, further committed with a deeper understanding and with more experience that I poured back into students through history and math, building their self-confidence, their sense of belonging, their purpose for education, their desire for new knowledge and understanding, to continue to improve their communities with new eyes to see the assets in their communities. And it's with that experience that I'm blessed to work with all of you in this partnership with the Achievement Network. Next. I'm excited for the year. We're working weekly with the district steering committee to set a vision for this work. We're excited to host an anti-racist diagnostic process. We're looking forward to training the change team through reflections and workshops and ensuring that all of you have anti-racist resources to deepen your knowledge and experience with this work. Our next slide. When I joined the Achievement Network, our mission and vision for educational equity was extremely strong. But I noticed that in our work with schools and partners, without a lens on race and racism, we were not getting to the root cause of inequities. Understanding how race and oppression are barriers helped us make more strategic moves to take action towards equity for students. As an organization, we've been working on our own journey of anti-racism for the last 7 years. We are at a point where we can now say with integrity that we've been on a journey and we can support others who are going in the same direction. Next slide. When the former president of the NEA, Lily Garcia, spoke about the racial inequities, she said, "Not everyone is uncomfortable talking about racism. There are so many brave people, brave organizations talking about the institutional racism that constructs systems of prisons and pensions and housing and healthcare. But I'm here as a teacher because the most insidious racism of all is one that denies an education." And I'm going to repeat that. I'm here as a teacher because the most insidious racism of all is one that denies an education. So our anti-racism work is grounded in compassion, and that literally means to suffer together with a desire to alleviate the suffering of others by dismantling systems that cause suffering. Next slide. And the best way to do that is through equity literacy skills. The ability to recognize, respond, and redress bias, to create bias-free classrooms and schools. And equity literacy skills is the way we operationalize compassion, and that starts with listening to our students. Next slide. We're going to practice that now. Listen to Joshua. Take note of what he's saying and what it makes you feel on your own journey.
I used to shame my parents by begging them to let me bring a Happy Meal inside a Vietnamese restaurant. The waitress would shift her eyes from my burger and my father. My mother would make an excuse for me. I do not blame them for speaking English to me at home. They wanted to ensure my survival. Houston houses a majority of poor Southeast Asian Americans. Bel Air Boulevard is their safe haven, a beacon for immigrants, tapioca shops and pho restaurants to keep us comfortable, parents taking under-the-counter jobs for their child's American dream, in hopes that they will live in their child's home one day. We, the children of immigrants, are likely to have lower SES. Our parents have no time to read to us books that are printed in English. One who grows up in Chinatown knows it is hard to survive outside, going to school in the day, making broth at night. Your accent can be the knife that shreds your future. Isolated because of where we come from. Ignored because of the model minority myth. America tries to keep us assimilated. A place where we can't get jobs. A place where we feel alone. A place where our tongues are not safe. Do you hear me?
And now I'll turn it over to Colleen O'Brien. Colleen is the Director of School Support at the Achievement Network, which means she coaches leaders across the country towards educational equity. Colleen?
Thank you, Tamoya, and hello, third floor. A little bit more about myself and what I do at Achievement Network. I also co-facilitate the White Anti-Racist Affinity Group, which is a group of white colleagues where we are committed to learning and exploring race, power, and privilege, pushing and holding each other accountable as we practice and redress inequities and bias. And I co-facilitate one of our Learning Together groups, which you'll learn a little bit more about this year. They're cross-functional teams where we dig deeply together to understand race, power, and privilege and take action through dialogue. I'm going to tell you a little bit today about my story and my own anti-racist journey in hopes that you can make connections to your own lives and your own stories and to connect ANet's purpose and what we do to your schools. I'm going to ask you to lean into vulnerability, and I'm going to lean into vulnerability as I talk about how compassion has helped me to build my skills and recognize bias and inequities. So moving on to a little bit about myself and my story. I come from a really big family, and being the second child definitely helped me be who I am now, responsible, determined, really silly, and very much a caretaker. I'm also an introvert by nature, so being in a big family, I had to learn how to debate, reach out of my comfort zone, and try to advocate for my needs when my brothers and sisters would actually let that happen. We're super tight, but I also have a really big chosen family, and you can see up there in the picture, all the kiddies that are there are my friends' kids, my nieces and nephews. They all call me auntie and uncle, and they're a really big part of our lives. So I was kind of a quiet and bookish kid at school and really silly and a little bit tougher at home. I was raised in a household with 2 different religions, and I was put into spaces constantly where I was told that I would go to a place where sinners would go. And that really hurt me because it was difficult. And what it did for me is that it actually piqued my interest and made me want to learn more about people's different worldviews. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about when I first found my purpose and my why, as Dr. Davis talked about earlier. When I was 14, I remember feeling upset about the mean things that my friends had been saying to me. And my father kind of stopped me and said, "Do you want to be walked on for the rest of your life?" And I knew that I didn't. So it was kind of a switch that went off inside of me, and it changed my trajectory. I had found my purpose. My why was now to be the change, to be kind, but also to be strong and independent, to feel empowered and also to empower others. Therefore, I started working on my self-confidence and began standing up for myself and for others. I also grew up in one of the most segregated areas of the country, Long Island in New York, and I grew up colorblind. While this gave me a base to feel I was being kind to all people, it also barred me from the opportunity to celebrate and learn about other cultures and to notice oppression. I heard things like, Don't describe people using black or white. We love all people. I don't see color. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I don't see race. And all of this color blindness hurt people around me, and it hurt me. I had a friend, a Black woman. She was in all of my honors classes. She was a fluent, a cheerleader, and we used to tell her, "You are the whitest Black girl we know," as if that was a compliment. We had told her that she was less than with that repeated phrase over and over. And we were unable to recognize her awesomeness and who she was. We just didn't see her. But even though I grew up colorblind, through engaging with and listening to marginalized voices on my anti-racist journey, I learned that colorblindness is harmful because it causes people to ignore the manifestations of racism and discrimination. It helped me to figure out that I needed to celebrate and learn about other cultures. And it was counterproductive to my why. Therefore, I began focusing on what is referred to as our first equity literacy skill, which is to recognize even the subtlest of biases and inequities. And this was done by looking inward at myself and how I reacted to different situations. I finally realized what I had been a part of. While I had proclaimed not to see color, what I saw and expressed was being white was the norm, and in turn had told her it was better. I had made her feel less than, as if who she was naturally in all of her beauty was not enough and never could be. And we had internalized this idea, all of us. Later on, I had a conversation with her as we were adults, apologizing for what I had been a part of and recognizing the harm I had caused again and again. And in those moments, I learned even more about the harm that I had caused and how it had affected her life. Hearing her voice and really listening with compassion helped me to build more of an understanding about my biases that were implicit as well as explicit. So moving on to another part of my life, after college in Baltimore, where I learned about service leadership and continued to learn and really study the differences in religions and philosophies, because this is still an interest to me, I worked in New York City in finance for several years. And while I loved numbers and loved working in the city, I realized there was a really big hole inside of me. How was I being the change if I was actually helping the rich get richer? And through a series of events, I coached a high school dance team, volunteered in Bronx, teaching elementary school kids about financial literacy, and an implicit recognition of my privilege, I changed my why. See, finance was male dominated where I worked. And while I enjoyed that environment at times, because I'm really big into football and sports, I also looked for some female friends in the office. I became friends with most of the women there. It was a really diverse group. And during a conversation, it came up that some of the women thought I was rich, and I was really confused. Well, you're white, so you must be rich. And I was, again, really confused. Our salaries were pretty similar. And yes, I made a little bit more money, but I also had a college degree in finance. And we got into a really interesting conversation around stereotypes and assumptions. And I learned a lot from these women, not only in that conversation, but over the years we worked together. I had been surprised because I didn't see myself as rich in the form of money. But looking back, what I realized was that I was rich in privilege. I had opportunities because of the color of my skin and the opportunities my parents had given me through their accumulated privilege over time. Right around this time, when I was having some realizations and was feeling empty, the students I had coached, my high school girls, had convinced me or pushing me towards education. Miss O, this is what you were meant to do. So using their voices, I decided to go back to school, change my why, rethink my purpose for engaging in this work. And my conclusion was that I needed to change. So I went back to school, commuted a couple times back and forth, and I had a new why: to be the change, but to support others to be the change too. And I became a New York City teacher. I've taught mostly elementary. I've had my hand in middle school, continued coaching dance, picked up coaching track for a few years. I've also been an administrator and a principal coach. But here's the thing. I initially came into education because I wanted to be a savior. My why had said that. I wanted to change the world for the better, and one of the best ways that I thought to do that was to model it. Other parts of myself that I had developed a little bit further said to jump into areas where I was uncomfortable. So I intentionally worked in schools where the cultures and religions were unfamiliar to me. I worked in areas that were different from the way that I grew up. These experiences accelerated my learning, and through my learning experience, I realized that my approach to save the children was not the most effective approach. I was not seeing my students and families and celebrating their differences. There was much to be unlearned. What I did realize was that in my schools with large English language learners and populations of multilingual learners, or students with learning and attention differences, which are generally Title I schools where we were, my students taught me about their cultures and their families and treated me like family. I learned why giving students the opportunity to speak in their native language is important, and that assimilation was not the way to liberation. To give space for them to teach others about why Eid or Rosh Hashanah was important and sacred, and to create an environment where we listened to each other and could disagree with each other and still learn from each other. And I'm pretty sure on most days, I was learning just as much, if not more, than my students. I was unlearning the biases of my childhood and experiences of my adulthood and relearning to value all parts of a person. I was continuously learning about the power of compassion, recognizing bias, and creating a social, emotional, environmental space where my students could thrive, feel strong and proud, and to feel safe to figure out who they were as people, particularly as young people of color. And guess what? All of this, it made me a better teacher, a more equitable teacher, a teacher that listens with their whole heart and found ways to give my students the instruction they deserved, because my bias wasn't getting in the way as much as it was before. And let's be serious, it's still there. I am still on my journey, but I'm getting better at recognizing it and redressing my behavior and my why. And at this time, my why shifted again. I moved from being mission-minded to walking alongside communities of color. And my why has been refined as I change and as I learn to not only recognize the bias and inequities within myself and within our society, but I'm also beginning to build up these skills. Listening with compassion to the voices around me, and intentionally lifting up voices of those that have identities that are different from mine. Our equity literacy skills are grounded in compassion. And my current why to walk alongside and listen compassionately to communities of color, to understand and redress bias and inequities, helps me to do my what, which is to deepen my commitment through education and action, to support leaders, teachers, staff, and students to break down our oppressive education system and to rebuild it as a system for all. My anti-racist journey is a lifelong process towards compassion and recognizing bias and inequities. I'm happy to be on it alongside you today. So we're going to talk a little bit more about our why. With all of this in mind, and after processing Dr. Davis's words, Tamoya, Joshua, and my stories, we'd like you to make connections to your why and your purpose. So consider how Michael Jr. does this effectively in the video we're going to show you next.
This is called How Do I Know? And a lot of times when people hear the phrase, how do I know? The next thing they say is what? How do I know what? But the key really isn't to know what, the key is to know why. Because when you know your why, you have options on what your what can be. For instance, my why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. My what is stand-up comedy. My what is writing books. My what can be going out with some friends to eat. In fact, another what that has moved me towards my why is a web series that we have out now called Break Time. So every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, you should subscribe to the channel. We do a series called Break Time on YouTube. So 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode. One episode in particular, I'm about to show you a clip to. We were in Winston-Salem. So Break Time, this is how it works. I travel the country, I do stand-up comedy, probably an hour and a half at an event. And in the middle of my show, I'll just sit down and start talking to the audience. And funny just happens. Or I'll meet somebody who's really interesting. So I met this one guy, and he said that he teaches music at a school. I was like, all right, you teach music, you know, can you sing? And then I'm just gonna show you the clip. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace,
How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying?
All right, all right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Right now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. So here's the thing. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time I asked him to sing, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what has more impact because you're walking in or towards your purpose.
Now you've heard a little bit from Michael Jr. and I told you about my life. You've heard a little bit about our experiences and how they led us to our why and how they guide us in service of our what. And we'd love to hear from you. So in the thought exchange, tell us about your why. Lean into vulnerability. This is a place to build connection and communication. Who or what inspires you? What makes you stay up at night grading and calling families and students? Has you double checking in the back of that bus to see if there are any kids there or to check on a student just one more time? Why do you do it all? And for those of you, there will be a link in the chat. And for those folks on Zoom, the bit.ly is on the screen for you to type in. We're just going to take a couple of minutes for everyone to jump in there. I see a lot of people talking about family. It pushes them to be the best that they can be and make sure they understand what they're doing is making a difference. Coming from a family of educators, feeling that it's in their blood. And we're going to let this stream for a little bit as we kind of go through. So please keep adding and sharing your stories. And thank you. I hope that you can take a look back at this later and learn more about your colleagues and maybe even give them a reminder about their why when times are kind of getting tough at work. So we're going to move on now to make a connection between our whys and ANet's how. And again, please keep dropping your whys in there. This is part of our definition of equitable instruction for all. We invite you to use it as an inspiration or reflective lens as you decide, clarify, or affirm the specifics of your vision for equitable instruction. Take a minute to see which bullets you really connect with and what to actualize with your students. Try to make a connection to your what and your why. And as you do, consider both this equity provision and your North Star and your why to ensure that there's meaningful progress in how to reimagine education that can serve all students this year. I know number 4 is one that always hits my heart, students shouldering the cognitive lift, because as educators, we know all the answers, so let's let them, well, not all of them, we think we do, right? But let our students shoulder that cognitive lift. So we're now going to hear from one of our esteemed colleagues, Marie, to tell you about her story. Marie Kodama is a senior content specialist in both the English language arts and anti-racism teams at ANet. She works on developing the diagnostic and interim assessments that we provide to our partners, ensuring that they are not only aligned to standards and curriculum, but they are also representative of our students. Marie?
Thanks, Colleen, and good afternoon, everyone. As I share my story, I want to anchor on the principle around establishing a classroom that is sustaining a student's cultures. Because as a student of color myself, I didn't feel like I had the option to be myself at school. I'll share more about this in a minute. But in our time today, I'll continue to help deepen our understanding of the student experience through my personal experience as a student of color and by grounding in research about student experience. Moving on, I'd love to start by sharing a little bit about myself and my journey to committing to becoming anti-racist. As is common with most people of color, my first racialized experience took place pretty early on in my life, almost as soon as I stepped foot in the school for the first time in the US. I emigrated from Tokyo, Japan to New York City when I was in first grade, and I only had a basic knowledge of English, like the word apple. As you can see on the right, my mom equipped me with a set of flashcards to use with my classmates and teachers. On one side are essential phrases in English, like, may I use the restroom? May I go to the nurse? And the other side were in Japanese. I would show these flashcards to communicate in the early days of getting acclimated to an English-only environment. Personally, I think it was quite innovative for my mom to prepare me with these flashcards, but my classmates didn't think so. My use of these flashcards to communicate, as well as my inexperience in English overall, soon became a point of ridicule. And I was bullied by one classmate in particular throughout the year. It was my mom, not my teacher though, who noticed something was off and intervened. And I still remember very vividly my mom sitting me down to explain to me that the classmate that was bullying me was an immigrant herself, and that before I joined the class, she had been bullied too. And she most likely wanted to feel in control by bullying me. I learned through this experience that I was different for being Japanese American. And also looking back now, I realized that this was my first introduction to how there's often a lack of solidarity among people of color, and how racism is so much about control and power. Moving on, I then moved to Houston, Texas for middle and high school, where I lived in overwhelmingly white communities and went to schools that reflected that demographic data. My parents really tried their best to instill in me pride for being Japanese American, but spending most of my hours at school in an environment where my difference wasn't celebrated, it was hard for my parents to counteract my desire to assimilate into white culture in order to fit in at school. I remember being called Twinkie or banana all the time, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And to be quite honest, I rejoiced in that. I felt happy and proud to be called those names because I was so desperate to be considered white like everyone else at school. It was only when I went on to college where I met other peers of color that could share in my upbringing and school experience and have late night conversations in our dorms about race that I started unlearning the shame and self-hate for being a person of color. And I began to embrace my authentic identity. Moving on, from my personal experience, I didn't want other children of color to be subjected to constant self-doubt about their worth and instead feel liberated. So I directed a summer and after-school program for immigrant and refugee children in Boston, where we tried to create a safe and affirming environment for these children to practice and improve their English. We had a mix of mostly Vietnamese and Cape Verdean students, and I noticed that there was just so much racial tension between these groups. I overheard countless comments from my Vietnamese students mocking the intellect of their Cape Verdean classmates. And witnessing this immediately took me back to my experience being bullied when I started school in the US. As an Asian American, it was then that I began to deeply reflect on anti-Blackness in society at large, but also within the Asian American community in particular. I also thought about how I need to do more to contribute to solidarity between the Asian American and Black communities. I knew I had to act to address the anti-Blackness within my own Asian American community, and one way I tried to do so was by helping publish a series of letters called Letters for Black Lives in English, as well as in almost 50 languages, to 1, amplify the humanity of Black people and their lives, 2, acknowledge the allyship that Asian Americans need to demonstrate, and 3, offer a conversation guide to help us have tough conversation about race with our families. Moving on, since then, I've been increasingly committed to anti-racism and in particular fighting against anti-Blackness, which is a commitment that I actively renew every day and continue to learn. At ANet on the assessment team, I've led efforts to examine bias on our assessment passages by developing a set of criteria that are anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-ableist, and anti-classist, and by launching a committee that vets our passages against those criteria. My team has also been invested in diversifying our passages through a multi-year strategy to increase representation of characters and figures of color on our assessments. And more recently, I've been working on the anti-racism and culture team on research and data analysis that support our work to embed anti-racism in schools, which includes designing tools like surveys and focus groups to measure the skill and will of organizations and individuals to engage in anti-racism work. Moving on, in my role doing research and data analysis, I've come across some key pieces of research that highlight the importance of having an anti-racist stance as educators. I'd love to share some of these headlines. We know that there are 4 bodies of research that hint at the need for educators committed to anti-racism in order to unlock learning, engagement, and sense of belonging for all students. One body of research shows that minority teachers have more positive expectations for minority students' achievement than non-minority teachers. Educational equity is a guarantee that educators engage all students with meaningful support that they need to reach and exceed a common standard through high quality instruction. And without holding high expectations for our students of color, educational equity is simply not possible. We know there's often a focus on standards-aligned instruction and high-quality instructional materials, but they cannot come to life and have the impact on students that we desire if we do not also reflect on our beliefs about students and their abilities to succeed. A second body of research concludes that bias in schooling, including things like cultural insensitivity, disproportionately harsh discipline, lower teacher expectations, tracking Black students into special education or remedial classes, they all have the cumulative effect of diminishing Black students' enthusiasm and motivation for school. We must integrate anti-racist practices like creating a classroom that is sustaining a student's culture and cultivates a growth mindset so that we can promote engagement of all students, especially children of color. A third body of research shows that the cumulative impact of subtle manifestations of racism had lasting and damaging impact on the self-perceptions of students of color. This highlights the importance of showing up to our students with compassion and developing equity literacy skills, including noticing subtle bias in learning materials and classroom interactions so that we can affirm the authentic identities of students. I know this all too well from firsthand experience. I can say that there was lasting and damaging impact on my self-esteem that my middle and high schools had, because those schools made me feel less than for being different and made me aspire to whiteness as if it were better than my own identity. This experience denied me the opportunity to develop a positive self-concept in those formative years of my life. And lastly, the fourth body of research illuminates that strong teacher-student relationships were associated on practically every measure schools care about: higher student academic engagement, attendance, grades, and lower school dropout rates. Anti-racist practices and equity literacy skills, like being able to recognize and also redress biases and inequities in the classroom, are so fundamental to developing affirming and trusting relationships with students of color in particular. And I know, again, from personal experience, what a world of difference it would have made for me to have a teacher that knew how to practice equity literacy skills. I still remember how hard it was to continue learning when I was in first grade, knowing full well that my teacher witnessed, but never intervened in the racialized bullying that was happening to me. My personal experience, coupled with these bodies of research, highlight the importance of integrating anti-racist practices in instruction so that we might see improved outcomes for students in terms of not only learning, but also engagement and sense of belonging, especially for our students of color. Moving on, I've talked about the student experience from a personal as well as a research perspective, but to continue building and practicing the first equity literacy skill of recognizing even the subtlest of biases and inequities, we'll center again on the student voice. Let's continue to listen to students like DeAndre here. And as you listen to DeAndre, think about what he's saying and what that makes you feel.
Today in school, I learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Learned my numbers, my colors, my blacks, my whites, my darks, my lights. Learn what can happen when you place enough dark children in one place at one time. You can fit an entire economy on their backs. Place a plantation in their schoolyard, bars in their windows, and label them state property. Today in school, I learned that 25% of the world's inmates are American and 40% of those are dark, which I find quite ironic because statistically counting, I know more cousins in college studying statistics and accounting than I can count cousins slaving in county. Today in school, I learned that my textbook sounds like a gun range. Martin Luther Black, Malcolm Black, Huey Black. Today in school, I learned that my name sounds like a gunshot. Can't hold a black man's name, scream, body, a dream in your mouth without getting a bullet stuck in between your teeth. Learn the 13th Amendment got a loophole that look like a noose. Slavery is legal as long as it's used for a punishment, for a crime. Today in school, I learned that when you put the words black and student together in a prison sentence, it sounds like a felony. Sounds like 12 years slavery written entitled, "Show me your ID, son. Where you going this time of day? Shouldn't you be in school? Look awful lot like your daddy and your daddy's daddy and his chalk outline and his chalk outline and his inmate number and his concrete coffin." And today in school, I learned that they rather fill up prison beds than classrooms. And the amount of African history taught in America is so small it can be ingrained on a single bullet and still blow your mind. Do you hear me?
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and show compassion for DeAndre here. Now we'll continue practicing compassion and equity literacy skills by listening to Dr. Kareem Salam as he speaks on the impact of trauma on children. And it's truly an honor for me to introduce him to you all. Dr. Kareem Latif Salam is originally from Brick City or Newark, New Jersey. In 1993, he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the College of New Jersey, which was known at the time as Trenton State College. Dr. Salam earned his medical degree from Rutgers Medical School in 2000, which was known at the time as Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. He completed a residency in general psychiatry at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he served as chief resident in 2004. He went on to complete a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at Thomas Jefferson University, also in Philadelphia, in 2006. Dr. Salam currently serves as the medical director of adolescent services at Friends Hospital in Northeast Philadelphia, and he's also a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Drexel University College of Medicine in Philadelphia from 2006 to present. At Drexel, Dr. Salam trained residents and fellows in child and adolescent psychiatry. He currently supervises third and fourth year medical students. In 2013 and 2019, Dr. Salam was the recipient of the Dean's Award for Excellence in Clinical Teaching by the graduating class of medical students at the Drexel University College of Medicine. Dr. Salam has been a fellow of the American Psychiatric Association since 2017. He has been board certified in adult and child and adolescent psychiatry since 2007 and recertified since 2016. In 2017, Dr. Salam, along with 9 other African American psychiatrists from many different parts of the country, became founding members of Global Health Psychiatry. GHP is a company focused on reducing the stigma of mental illness in communities of color through education and community action. Since 2018, GHP has published 2 groundbreaking books, co-authored by Dr. Salam, that increase awareness while uplifting the community surrounding Black mental health. These books are 2018's Mind Matters, a resource guide to psychiatry for Black communities, and their 2019 follow-up, How Amari Learned to Love School Again, a story about ADHD. Dr. Salam currently resides in the greater Philadelphia area with his wife of over 22 years, Veronica, and their 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Salam.
Good afternoon, everyone. Could everyone see and hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Marie for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank ANet for allowing me the opportunity to participate in this anti-racist work. And I would like to thank the Ferg Floor School District for inviting me to participate in this groundbreaking work. Next slide, please. I'd like to share with you some elements of my journey. If you look at the photograph on the left, that was taken in the late 70s. So in that photograph is my older brother and my mother, Maxine Salam. I'm in the forefront of that photograph. I'm about 7 years old. My mother is critically important because though we didn't have money, what we lacked in financial resources, she more than made up for in love and spiritual wealth. And she passed down a value system to me that really emphasized the importance of remaining on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And in Arabic, that means the straight path, so that I could avoid major pitfalls and major errors that could have consequences that could follow me through the balance of my life. The gentleman pictured in the center frame is my uncle, Malcolm Dunn, Malcolm Rodney Dunn, my mother's older brother. He was a successful African-American businessman. And in my life, he was my North Star for manhood. And for me, that had to be a Black man. My uncle never earned a college degree, but he was brilliant. He taught me the value of hard work and its rewards. He taught me the ability to hustle. And when I felt my dream of becoming a physician was drifting away, he called me and he said, son, there are people who are taller than you, more handsome than you, and smarter than you, but I taught you they can't outwork you. So get to work, son. And I thank Uncle Malcolm. He transitioned out of this life into the next life on New Year's Day, 2019. But it's important. This concept applies to Black boys and girls, and it applies to human beings writ large. But human beings, particularly young human beings, boys and girls, but I'm going to focus on boys, they need to see, spend time with, have meals with, hug, talk to, and question the men they wish to become. They have to see these men to become these men. And because I shared time on the planet Earth with Uncle Malcolm, I became a version of him. And he would always say a better version of him. If you look at the panel, the rightmost panel, that photograph was taken in the 90s. I'm a proud member of the oldest African-American fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, that was founded at Cornell University in 1906. Those are many of my frat brothers. Some of the more noteworthy alphas are the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Thurgood Marshall. Through Alpha, I met like-minded scholarly men who were driven, ambitious, and focused and community-oriented. The advantage of the chapter I pledged, there was the College of New Jersey, my alma mater, Rider University, and Princeton University. And my exposure to the brothers from Princeton altered my perspective. Though I knew they weren't more intelligent than me, they were better prepared than me, and they trained differently than I. And so I knew how I wanted things organized in my family life, so I could, so those opportunities could be available for my children. Next slide, please. Finally, this is my tribe. That's my wife, Veronica, and my son and my daughter. And I think of them constantly, and I work hard to provide for my family. And when I was a young man, I always dreamt of the family I wanted to have. And this is us on family vacation during a GHP retreat. Next slide, please. You already heard about Global Health Psychiatry. Those are the 10 original founders of Global Health Psychiatry. And God willing, we will be publishing additional books in the very near future. COVID has upended everything, so our third book is on ice at this time, but it will be released, God willing, within the next year. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Multi-level trauma, awareness, and support in the setting of organizational change, COVID-19, racial injustice, and subsequent unrest. Next slide, please. It's always important that you have a roadmap for your journey. And in this case, these are the objectives of the presentation: to guide educators in becoming familiar with trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, to support educators in recognizing race-based traumatic stress, to support educators in identifying trauma secondary to COVID-19 and racial injustice, more commonly referred to as the twin pandemics, and to provide perspective on specific racial events in the journey of African Americans in this country. And finally, to equip educators to become better observers of how racial trauma impacts young people and how to advocate for them in vivo in the moment and to advocate on their behalf. Next slide, please. Before entering this work, we have to adopt the following thought. We have to recognize, respect, and honor our shared humanity. This nourishes our compassion that's required to heal from our own trauma and that of our students. Next slide, please. Trauma is defined by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, involves an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by individuals or groups of people that results in physical or emotional harm and could be experienced as life-threatening. Trauma has lasting adverse effects on the individual and their ability to function in multiple realms. Next slide, please. There are some common trauma responses. You could fight and resist the trauma. You could flee the trauma. You could freeze like a deer in the headlights. You could submit or attach to your oppressor who's the perpetrator of the trauma, similar to Stockholm Syndrome. When you think of trauma, folks often associate that with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a mental health condition that occurs in human beings. According to the American Psychiatric Association, PTSD occurs in almost 4% of US adults. 1 out of 11 people will be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder in their lifetime, and women are more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder than men, and that's largely an indictment of the epidemic of sexual assault throughout this land. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. This is the byproduct of the work of Vince Felitti and Bob Onda, who are family practice physicians who noticed that there were profoundly negative health outcomes associated with certain childhood experiences. So ACEs, potentially traumatic events that occurred during childhood. It's important to remember that these could be perceived as toxic stress, and they're extreme and repetitive, and they could be highly damaging to the development of the brain and the body. Next slide, please. Common ACEs are child maltreatment, more commonly referred to as child abuse. The most common form being neglect, when you fail to meet the basic needs of the young person, food, clothing, and shelter. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence, particularly male on female. Living in a home, growing up in a home where substances are used, or your parent or caregiver has mental health issues, or a change in the family constellation, separation or divorce, incarceration. So you have a parent who's incarcerated, they leave the home, or you have a parent who re-enters the home who is the perpetrator of trauma. ACEs could have profoundly damaging impacts on physical and mental health, whether it be chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or depression or anxiety. Next slide, please. The biology of stress, the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The hypothalamus and pituitary glands are neighbors buried deep within the brain. They communicate by way of chemical signals, more commonly referred to as hormones. In the setting of stress, the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary gland to produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, which activates the adrenal glands, which are those golden pyramid-shaped structures sitting atop the kidneys. And they produce stress hormones like cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. The way this system is supposed to work, it's supposed to work in bursts, PRN, pro re nata, as needed. So in the setting of stress, you have surges of these hormones to increase your blood pressure, to make your senses more acute, to increase blood flow to muscles and away from your deeper organs and functions like digestion, to prepare you for fight or flight. If this system is chronically activated, next slide, please, it could lead to a phenomenon called weathering, which is highly damaging to multiple organ systems in the body. And as a result of this high level of toxic stress, you could have premature aging. You could have young people in their 30s or 40s suffering from cardiovascular events like heart attacks or cerebrovascular events like strokes. Disorders that normally should occur after several decades of life and not so early in life. ACEs affect learning and behavior. They could be damaging to the architecture of the developing brains of young people, affecting brain functions such as attention, memory, planning, executive functioning, very important skills for successful advancement in an educational environment. ACEs affect learning and behavior, and these are the brain regions that are typically affected, whether it be executive functioning that's governed by the prefrontal cortex, which is the section of the brain that lies behind the forehead, fear processing, emotional memory processing in the hippocampus, or stress management. Additionally, students who've been exposed to 3 or more ACEs are almost 3 times as likely to fail a grade. Students with 3 or more ACEs are significantly more likely to be unable to perform at grade level, to be classified special education, or to be the recipients of harsh discipline, whether it be suspension, expulsion, and school for these young persons tends to become a place where they are not validated. They are taught about how lousy they are, and most people with common sense would withdraw from an environment that's not validating. Moving on to race-based traumatic stress. The mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racism, ethnic discrimination, and sometimes in severe instances, hate crimes. Individuals who are experiencing these emotionally painful events, they could become injured as a result of this trauma. And in an environment that's governed by the dominance of white people, folks of color are particularly vulnerable to this type of trauma, particularly the African-American community, the Latinx community, or the community of indigenous peoples. Next slide. Race-based trauma could have a somatic presentation, whether it be headaches, chest pain, insomnia. Psychological symptoms include hypervigilance and paranoia, or recurrent re-experiencing phenomena related to the trauma. During sleep, these are referred to as nightmares of prior traumatic events. And during the day, in severe cases, it could be flashbacks, to the extent that folks are temporarily divorced from their surroundings and they dissociate. Mental injury results from prolonged exposure of to this type of racial trauma. Moreover, you could have groups of people with shared collective trauma who have such experiences, whether it be Jewish people who've experienced the Holocaust or are descendants of those who experienced the Holocaust, the forced removal of indigenous people from their tribal lands, and the enslavement of Africans in this country. Next slide, please. Internalized devaluation and the assaulted sense of self. So how is a young person to feel, particularly a young person of color, when they're in an environment where white is elevated and celebrated, and at best, many of them are often merely tolerated? So if that's the situation, what does it mean for me if I'm not white? Does that mean that I'm unworthy? Does that mean that I'm less than? What's particularly problematic with this scenario is that if you face an unstoppable tide of harmful race-related messages, sometimes you don't even realize it happens because it's happening so frequently. And you feel like you're immersed in a toxic miasma. And oftentimes you don't realize it until you step away from it. But for example, you may have educators who question your ability to handle more rigorous coursework, or folks who look like you who suggest you can't handle the rigorous coursework, or who try to cut you down for your ambition and pursuing educational opportunities. This is particularly harmful during adolescence, when identity is consolidated and these young people are psychologically ambushed by these messages that could throw them off course and alter the trajectory of their lives. Next slide, please. What can we do? Again, recognition of humanity, compassion. You'll hear that through and through today. Compassion. You can't tell these kids enough that their lives matter, that their education and their futures matter. Just like you all have children and their lives matter and their educations and futures matter to you, so do the lives, futures, and educations of these young people. Adults should advocate for these kids, teach them, defend these kids in the moment, and teach these kids how to defend themselves, particularly in educational environments. Educators serve a very important role in this society, and it ought to be elevated. Educators could be mentors, advocates, and essential witnesses. Folks who take an interest in a young person, who recognize their humanity and their value, and they offer guidance. In the setting of that unstoppable tide of negative images and messages that most young people of color are faced with as it applies to their identity, there are times you almost have to brainwash yourself not to fall victim to this onslaught. And my credo is the following. It's a quote from my hero, Muhammad Ali. And he said, if you don't think you're the greatest, you better pretend. And you better pretend, because you're often, there's no shortage of people in the world who will send you negative messages about yourself. especially if you're an African-American young person. So more contemporary ACEs are COVID-19 and racial injustice. I referred to the twin pandemics. COVID-19 is a novel event, once in a century event. It's disrupted and upended life as we knew it. Families are spending more time together and they're not used to it. So you have increased rates of child maltreatment and intimate partner violence. And child welfare agencies have noticed there's been a precipitous decline in reports of suspected child abuse. And that's because we don't have our young people in school buildings where they're in classrooms with mandated reporters. And so many of these events are going unnoticed and unreported, and these young people are suffering in silence. COVID-19 and racial injustice has laid bare disparities in multiple realms in society, whether it be health and education and the like. Next slide, please. The climate crisis. Those who aren't climate deniers know about climate change, but the climate crisis I'm referring to is the racial crisis in this country. 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that was the amount of time on video where a police officer took the life of George Floyd, and he transitioned from this life to the next right before our very eyes. Sadly enough, unarmed Black men have been the victim of these horrible events, whether it be at the hands of law enforcement like George Floyd or private citizens like Trayvon Martin. Breonna Taylor is one of the women who's been victimized in this way, and we ought to elevate her and say her name. Sadly enough, within the last 2 weeks, no one was brought to justice in the taking of her life. And the one officer that was charged because bullets landed in the apartment of her white neighbors. And there were bullets also found in the apartments of her Black neighbors. There were no charges for those bullets, and there were no charges brought forth for the taking of her life. So again, I ask, how are young people to feel when they see this? Young people are taught to do what older people do and not so much what they say. I encourage folks, if you live in a home and you have cable television and they're playing these videos on a loop, turn off the television. Our young people don't need to be exposed to this. 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I viewed that once. That video grabbed me, held me, and refused to let me go. It's more important to have a conversation with young people about these issues. We have to reassure them. We cannot guarantee their safety, but we could minimize risk. We could reassure them, educate them, and then we could act, whether it be peaceful protesting or teaching them how to survive an encounter with law enforcement. Next slide, please. These are some of the traumatic aspects of COVID-19. They'll come up again and again during this presentation. Next slide, please. COVID has been a particular threat in terms of illness, the threat of death. What's particularly unique and disturbing about COVID is folks are dying in isolation, and they're not given an opportunity to communicate with their loved ones in person before they transition out of this life. And it's simply brought economic upheaval on families, particularly those of color. Next slide, please. Racial inequities in the setting of racial violence. This is a form of trauma, and oftentimes it could require additional mental health treatment in the setting of these visible racial inequalities, and diminished trust in institutions. And when I think a more useful synonym in my mind for institutions are bureaucracies, whether it be the one I work in, healthcare, the educational system, or law enforcement. Next slide, please. So COVID's impact on education. Before we get into that, many of our most vulnerable students from marginalized populations face challenges pre-COVID, whether it be having unemployed adults as their caregivers, food insecurity, living in food deserts, homelessness, increased economic uncertainty. And imagine the impacts that these factors have on students and on their mental health. And you add to that COVID. Next slide, please. COVID has upended life as we knew it. So it's forced students to learn differently, and that onset was pretty abrupt. It's forced educators to deliver a content in a way that may not be comfortable for them. And again, it's laid bare inequities, whether it be lack of access to reliable broadband, Wi-Fi, or simply quiet space for students to study and learn. Educators, and you'll really appreciate this, are worried about their own safety in the setting of in-person instruction, given the ability of COVID to be transmitted through respiratory droplets or through airborne mechanisms. Parents have been forced to become educators overnight, and they've not been trained, like many of the people in this audience. Moreover, they're figuring out a positive way to occupy time for their children who are not physically in school. Parents and caregivers feel out of their depth. I know I certainly did, as did my wife, but we're doing our best. And then getting kids returning to school, what does that look like? There's so much uncertainty as it applies to COVID, and that breeds anxiety. Sadly enough, there's not been a coordinated response to this pandemic. And again, you'll hear that many times, uncertainty breeds anxiety. 1/3 of US adults report feeling stress and anxiety and great sadness in the setting of COVID, and they don't feel they can cope in social isolation. We have almost 7.3 million coronavirus cases and almost 210,000 deaths in this country. And we just learned within the last 24 hours, the president and the first lady of the United States have tested positive for COVID. And we wish them we wish them health, safety, and wellness, as we do all Americans and people the world over who have suffered at the hands of this scourge. Special considerations during COVID: African Americans, sadly enough, represent, as a percentage of the population, the highest number of cases, the highest numbers of hospitalizations and deaths. And following closely behind are indigenous peoples and then the Latinx population. This simply highlights that point. Indigenous peoples, Latinx population, and African Americans have 3 times the cases of white people, and they have nearly 5 times the hospitalization rates and almost twice the death rates, particularly in the African American community. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We talked about the twin pandemics, the convergence of COVID and racism laid bare on our television screens. And it's also highlighted these inequities, whether it be in healthcare, mental health care, finances, and the like. Next slide, please. So for a variety of reasons, and I won't, many of them are listed here, I won't go through all of them. COVID has had a disproportionately negative effect on the African American community, whether it be due to rates of medical comorbidities, living in densely populated environments, overrepresentation in incarceration settings, or overrepresentation in forward-facing jobs. Next slide, please. When you compare the first half of 2019 to the first half of 2020, or particularly when COVID was at its peak in May and June of this year, there's been a spike in folks who screen positive for anxiety and depression, and among all groups. And of course, leading the pack are African Americans and the Latinx population. And more specifically, there's been a spike in folks screening positive for anxiety and depression right around the time of the slaying of George Floyd, especially among the African American and Asian population. So it's obvious to see with George Floyd, he was African American. So if you're a member of that community, you may fear for your own safety and develop a sense of a foreshortened future. And one of the police officers was visibly Asian. And in the setting of COVID, because the virus came from Wuhan, there's been a lot of anti-Asian American racism in the setting of COVID. So these numbers translate into an additional almost 1.5 million more African Americans screening positive for anxiety and depression, and 800,000 or almost 1 million Asian Americans screening positive for anxiety and depression. Next slide, please. Interestingly enough, a similar trend was not observed in the Latinx population because the thinking was that there was the situation with young children being separated from their families at the border, at the southern border of the United States. And these were largely Latinx folks, and that dominated the airwaves. But in the setting of these visible acts of the slangs of unarmed Black folks, those images were replaced with these images of struggle in the African American community. And so the light shifted from the Latinx community to the African American community. Next slide, please. This is critically important for folks like us, whether you be whether you're a physician or a healthcare professional or you're an educator. Self-care is critical. Self-care cannot be done for you. You really have to advocate for yourself, engage in positive thinking, and not have your mind dominated by negative cognitions. Stay connected by using technology, leverage the technology to remain socially connected in an environment of physical distancing. Engage in relaxing activities like going outdoors, spending time in the sunlight and fresh air so your skin can make vitamin D, and focus on your mental health, your physical health, in the service of improved wellness. Next slide, please. So again, these are images of the menacing, the bottom left is the COVID-19, the coronavirus. And then we have a scene from a peaceful protest. We have a lot going on in this world, tremendous sources of stress. There are many moving parts. Next slide, please. Shifting to the history and experience of African Americans in this country and the ongoing disparities in various realms, whether it be income, employment, housing, or healthcare, it seems like these disparities aren't going away. If we think about our history in this land, we could start with the Middle Passage. I know Tamoya mentioned how our history did not begin there, but our history in this country began there. We had a vast, very positive history predating our arrival to these shores. However, the trauma of the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade, those effects have not diminished significantly over centuries. And you follow that up with Jim Crow laws and the Civil Rights Movement. Next slide, please. It's important for folks to remember that African Americans have had full citizenship rights for just over 50 years. I'm not quite 50, but I'm very close. So just think of that. In the 70s, there was, previous slide, please. In the 70s, there was affirmative action in the spirit of redressing some of these wrongs and reversing some of these positions. In the 80s, there was the rise of visibility of African Americans. This has particular poignance for me because one of my medical role models was Dr. Heathcliff Huxtable. For those of you who don't know, that was Bill Cosby's character in The Cosby Show. But the sad fact is that there was such a dearth of African American male physicians in communities like mine, Brick City, Newark, New Jersey. I had to choose a fictional character as my medical role model. And sadly enough, there was an opinion piece written in the Journal of the American Medical Association entitled The Medical Unicorn, and that's the African American male physician. So my hope, my most sincere and fervent hope is that I could serve as a beacon of inspiration for young brothers and sisters in these communities who aspire to become physicians. Fast forward to the 90s and the riots in Los Angeles in the wake of the Rodney King verdict. There was the Million Man March in 1995, And there were many people who mistakenly mentioned that we've ushered in a post-racial era in 2008 with the election of the first African-American president, Barack Obama. Next slide. In the first decade of this millennium, this has particular relevance to Ferguson because of the situation with Michael Brown, where his life was taken, and others like Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner. And it seems like this this problem has escalated in the second decade of this millennium in the setting of COVID-19. But again, I remind you, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, it's important that we limit the exposure of these images being broadcast into our homes, especially if we have young children around. Next slide, please. Systemic racism. So we hear about that frequently, and this has to do with power and the acquisition and protection of resources. A particular trivia point is the genetic theory of inferiority, eugenics. So the theory that if you're not white, you're less than, you're inferior in multiple realms, particularly intellectually. I always heard that certain standardized tests were culturally biased, but I never felt I had the evidence. I recently learned that a psychological researcher, Dr. Brigham, who worked at Princeton University, was tasked with developing a cognitive test for military recruits. 3 years after that effort, his test was used to develop a test to assess students' ability or aptitude for college readiness, known as the SAT. Dr. Brigham was a proponent of eugenics. So the SAT came from the womb of a proponent of eugenics. Now I have the evidence that I need. Moving forward, bias in standardized testing, racism and white supremacy, the school to prison pipeline, microaggressions. In the setting of COVID, I'm no longer going to work wearing a shirt and tie, I'm wearing scrubs. I'm a 6'3" African-American male who's wearing scrubs. So in a hospital, I'm either an orderly, some folks have asked me if I'm a social worker, and it's never occurred to them that I'm a physician. And then you think of nutrition, toxic environments. Flint, Michigan comes to mind, but why talk about Flint? My hometown had a water crisis, Brick City, Newark, New Jersey. Elevated lead levels in water, and those of us know that elevated lead levels could interfere with cognition and academic advancement. And finally, harsh punishments meted out to young people who've been the victims of trauma, who engage in acting out behaviors. Should they be punished or should they receive treatment? Should they be harshly disciplined and removed from school, or should they see treatment? I can't emphasize this enough. These young people who are acting out sometimes aggressively, they must be viewed through the lens of trauma and ACEs. And if you can't commit to that work, then you're not doing them a positive service. Next slide, please. Systemic racism in school, we covered some of this material. Next slide, please. And again, these are things that must be done. Trauma and stress interfere with student learning, lead to poor student engagement, a profound sense of frustration and hopelessness. Interestingly enough, depression in young people more commonly presents as anger and irritability versus sadness and the blues. Anger and irritability is a depressive equivalent in children and adolescents. Please remember that. And consider this when young folks are engaging in acting out behaviors. Next slide, please. Addressing inequity requires compassion, a recognition of our shared humanity. And I believe it was Colleen O'Brien who spoke about the differences in our journeys. We don't put a value judgment on our journeys. They're different, just like skin color. One is not better, one is not worse. And once upon a time, we were all kids. We were all insecure. We all had uncertainties. Some of us had adults in their lives to love and nurture them and guide them. And many of the young people who we are helping, they may not have some of these advantages. And to to the extent that we are able, if we identify a need, we should try to support these young people and be an ally for them in vivo, in the moment, to correct the mistakes as they're being made, and finally teaching them how to advocate for themselves. Using our empathy and compassion, we should observe our students. We're intelligent people. Don't unsee what you know you see, whether it be a loss of interest in school activities, learning, extracurriculars, an abrupt change in a child's mood. The mood is the verbal report of your emotional state. The affect is the outward display of your emotional state, typically by facial expression. So if you notice a change in those, you should inquire. Changes in behavior in a young person without regard for consequences, gravitating towards a peer group that engages in high-risk behaviors, whether it be substance use, criminal activity, sexual promiscuity, all high-risk behaviors, and a loss of future orientation. We should investigate these things. However, in the setting of COVID, it's difficult to do that. I'll say it again. Educators, these behavioral difficulties, please view them through the lens of stress, trauma, and ACEs. Those may explain those may actually be the underpinnings of these young people's maladaptive behaviors. Next slide, please. Continuing to use our empathy. Rapport is everything. If you have a relationship with a student, then they will make themselves available to you, but sometimes it takes work. Some of our students have been traumatized. Some of our students have been rejected. Some of our students have been trained to keep their guards up and to not trust people. However, if you recognize their humanity and you try, you could build on the relationships once you've established rapport. Check in and reassure students when you notice a change. Report any suspicion of child maltreatment. Refer them to the guidance office or guidance counselor and close the loop. Hey, did you check in on that kid? What happened? What was the result? Finally, some of our students are very guarded in their approach, and their experience with people who don't look like them, maybe Caucasian folks who are not from their communities, perhaps they haven't been positive, or perhaps they've been trained to distrust folks who don't look like them. It's still worth making an investment in a young person and pursuing the ask. That's how you establish rapport, build a relationship that you could leverage at a later time. Remain ever vigilant. We're human beings before we're physicians, before we're teachers, before we're highly educated professionals, and we could all fall victim to compassion fatigue. Hence, you must prioritize self-care, modeling. Again, that can't be done for you. We must model compassion for ourselves and for our students. They're watching us. And remember, students are quite impressionable, so we have to mold the clay properly. Kids have an innate justice, and the parents in the audience could attest to this if you have more than one child. They're excellent accountants. He got this, she got that. Well, our children, our students in the classroom are the same way, and they notice when they're treated differently compared to students from a different demographic. So be mindful of that. Education is freedom. In my personal story, education transformed my life. In practical terms, it expands your options in terms of career and financial opportunities. In philosophical terms, it's difficult to enslave an educated person. That's why slaves weren't allowed to read. And one of the most brilliant former slaves who was an autodidact was Frederick Douglass, and he wrote about this. And in my mind, it was the hand of God that really informed the skill with which he wrote. But education is freedom. A man or woman who could solve problems is very difficult to enslave. Previous slide, please. The transformative power of education, there's evidence for that in my own life. Within a single generation, I've traversed the socioeconomic scale through education. And what deeply saddens me, and I think it was Tupac who said, when you make it to the top, it's very lonely. And I think of brothers and sisters from my community, Brick City, Newark, New Jersey, who didn't make it, who didn't have a mom to keep them on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And an interesting story is my mother labored over my education and sent me to public school in 8th grade. And I ended up being the valedictorian that year. And my mother, she attended a teacher conference that year, and she was able to redirect an entire classroom to be quiet while she had a conversation with a social studies teacher. They hired her that day. That was September of my 8th grade school year, which ended the school year for me. However, my mother had more credibility on the corners of Brick City, Newark, New Jersey than me, because they would see her in her Muslim garb, and guys who were hustling, rolling dice, or doing whatever on the block, when they saw Mrs. Salam, they would always ask about how she was doing. And when she saw them, she saw one of her sons who had been incarcerated. She didn't fear them. In her mind, she gave birth to them. So she recognized their humanity, and she would talk to them. And interestingly enough, the first question that came out of their mouth was, what happened to your son? What happened to Kareem? And that's what saddens me deeply. So many of these kids didn't associate me with me because I was viewed as a nerd, but they, years later, decades later, they thought about what happened to me. Did he make it? And in retrospect, I'm able to take a look back at my journey and realize it was very difficult while I was in it, but it was so worth it. And I want to share that opportunity with other young brothers and sisters in these communities. Next slide, please. The fundamental ingredients: educators, those who are enthusiastic, have boundless energy, empathic, and trauma-informed. Educational opportunity is worth more than its weight in vibranium. I was a beneficiary of the EOF program, the Educational Opportunity Program in the College of New Jersey, and one of my mentors was Mr. Jim Boatwright. I'm forever in his debt for blessing me with that educational opportunity. Next slide. A little inspiration. This is how things are now. They won't be this way forever, and they will improve, God willing. Next slide. We should take a stand against racism. And as Dr. Davis mentioned, we need allies. We need folks. We need white folks. We need Asian folks. We need Latinx folks in this struggle with us so we could do this anti-racist work. Next slide. I want to mention the importance of mentorship and essential witnesses to support young people. This fosters resilience, and ACEs are not final determinants. They're not irreversible. There is hope. These are some things we could do. Some of this we reviewed already. Rethink discipline. We want to keep kids in school. Professional development for educators to learn social and emotional learning techniques. Coordinate supports for youth. This brings to mind Jeffrey Canada's work in the Harlem Children's Zone. Increase parental engagement, build and support self-regulation skills, and support trauma-informed classrooms. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of mentorship and essential witnesses. Persistence and resilience comes from having the opportunity to work through difficult times. Again, much of this is common sense, but it takes empathy to take the time to put this common sense into action. Listen and learn, seek to understand, be self-aware, monitor your own emotional responses, be mindful of your own wellness and self-care, as that cannot be done for you. Be honest about what you're healing and seek support from colleagues. Next slide. We're problem solvers. That's our superpower. We want to help our kids achieve like we've achieved. And this is very important work. You're investing in young people, and that has boundless returns. And finally, Nelson Mandela, we know who he is. Do not judge me by my success. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again. I believe this concludes the presentation, and thank you so much for this opportunity. And I think Dr. Davis has some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salam. Those were some powerful words, and I'm just excited to see a Black physician because, you know, like you said, especially Black men are unicorns in most professions, but especially in medicine. So thank you for those powerful words. But more importantly, I'm looking forward to the partnership and the guidance around learning. I've done some work around and reading around the ACEs research. And so I'm really excited to have a physician to help guide us in some of this work that we'll do to help all of our students, but especially our Black males, so that we can give them the opportunity to be liberated. I want to digress a moment and just acknowledge one of the statements I saw earlier, and I forget who showed it, but it essentially said that if you came here to help me, and to save me, then you're wasting your time. But if you came here because your liberation is inextricably tied to mine, then let's get started. And that's what it's about, is us liberating each other. So thank you so much for your words of encouragement and power. We've covered a lot today. And I want to thank our partners from ANet, as well, again, as Dr. Salam, for kicking off this work for this coming school year, and for laying the groundwork and for challenging us to move forward. One piece of housekeeping that I'd like to bring up at this moment is that you'll be receiving a link to a survey on today's session. Please take a couple of moments and complete that survey. As I've shared in at the outset of today, what is your why? As the lead teacher in this district, I want everyone on board. I want all of us learning together. And I heard someone say this earlier, a powerful word, and that word is vulnerability. We've got to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, especially in times like these. I certainly don't have it all figured out when it comes to equity, racism, and social justice, but I'm willing to put forth the work and to do my part. If I can be honest with you, I realize that some among us, some of you who, when you heard about this work, and as this session progressed today, you may have checked out, or maybe you've had previous bad experiences when it comes to dealing with racism, especially if you're white. And sometimes we take on these different roles depending on our race when we begin to have these race conversations. But I encourage you, if you felt accused or felt like it was your fault, that I encourage you to jump back in and join us, because we have so much work to do, and it's going to take all of us working together. Before I end, I want to take an opportunity just to acknowledge that we have put together a change team. We're going to have a couple of events, but I do want to acknowledge Chief Armstrong. He's with us today. He's the Chief of Police for the city of Ferguson, and I'm grateful to have him as a thought partner, because he's joined us, a fellow North Carolinian, who will be a great thought partner with us as we begin to do some work in our communities around community policing, but also just in empowering our students and all of our young people in the Ferguson and Florissant communities. So thank you, Chief Armstrong, for being a part of this work. If these words challenge you today and make you feel uncomfortable or cause you dissonance in your thinking, I'd encourage you to learn more. I also encourage you to rejoin the conversation. Find a way to connect with your why in this work. Spend time with your neighbors or colleagues who might not look like you or think like you. Ask questions and listen and learn, not just to respond, but to really hear what people are saying. I've always said our people are our greatest strength. And if this work is truly going to be transformative for Ferguson Florissant School District, then we need every one of you working together to make it happen. I also want to acknowledge Ms. Pamela Powell. She's our parent representative who's going to be on the panel as well, on our change team. Hats off to ANet, to the work that's going to happen for the children in our community. And I'm grateful to Dr. Salam for his expertise that he'll bring to support this work going forward. We really appreciate all of you today. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.